Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello and welcome to another episode on the New Books Network. I'm one of your hosts, Dr. Miranda Melcher, and I'm very pleased today to be speaking to Dr. Anelise Hanson's Shrout about her book titled Aiding Ireland, The Great Famine and the Rise of Transnational Philanthropy, published by NYU Press in 2024. This book looks at the Irish famine, but particularly reactions to it, and reactions in the form of philanthropy. This is really a key moment in understanding kind of how we get to a lot of the things that we probably don't think that much today, that are probably pretty normal today. So really interesting to go back in time and understand where this comes from. Anelise, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you please start us off by introducing yourself a little bit and explain why you decided to write this book?
Sure. So I am talking to you from Lewiston, Maine, where I teach at Bates College. My PhD is from New York University, and in the intervening years, I spent time at University College Cork and Cal State Fullerton in Southern California. So I've been many places. This book began as my dissertation, and it actually began when I was reading one of the sort of central works on famine history, which is Christine Keneally's A Death-Dealing Famine. And in it, Dr. Keneally talks about how one of what I think is the more famous donations to famine relief, which is that made by the Choctaws in 1847. So for the very smallest bit of context, in the 1830s, the U.S. government expropriated indigenous people from all over what was the United States to what is now the state of Oklahoma and was then called Indian Territory. And then the famine begins in 1845 when Irish potato crops fail and continue to fail for the next 7 years. So this was a crisis in Ireland, right? 1 million people out of a population of about 8.5 million died, and another 2 million emigrated. But it was also sort of in the aftermath of this crisis for the Choctaws, which is the violent removal from their ancestral homelands. And so I really wanted to understand sort of how news of the famine circulated so that it was being published in Indian Territory, in the Choctaw Nation. And that sort of led me down this rabbit hole where I kept coming across communities of people who became invested in Irish famine relief, but who themselves had no personal connections to Ireland. And so this book grew actually from what I thought would be just about the Cherokees and Choctaws sending money to Ireland into this more ranging study of a bunch of different people from around the world who weren't Irish themselves, who had no Irish family, but who nevertheless decided that this was the moment that they were going to become involved in international relief. So to put it really glibly, I really wanted to figure out why famine relief went viral in the middle decades of the 19th century.
So when we say things like went viral, right, bunches of people all over the world, what sort of scale are we actually talking about here when it comes to participating in this famine relief? And how unprecedented were these numbers?
Mm-hmm. So I think one of the really interesting things about famine fundraising is that it came from a really wide range of sources and then quite a lot of people within those communities. So some might call mainstream, sort of like the equivalent of NGOs today. So the British Relief Association, which was founded by Londoners who, again, had no relationship to Ireland except that they lived next door, raised something like £200,000, which is equivalent in purchasing power today to over £20 million. The Society of Friends, Quakers, founded an organization called the Central Relief Committee in 1846 and raised £400,000, which is closer to £50 million today. So we have these sort of big organizations that are garnering donations from thousands of people around the world. And one of the really cool things about this archivally for me is that the British Relief Association and the Central Relief Committee published lists of donors. So we can actually know who was sending money and how much they gave. Those lists of donors also included smaller and ad hoc organizations. So there was a group in New York called the General Relief Committee of the City of New York, and they raised about £200,000 then, about £5 million in today's money, from donors around the United States. So their donations were listed in the Quaker donor ledgers, and then I can go to the New York Committee's books to see who was giving to the New York Committee. Just to put these amounts in some context, in February of 2024, the British government announced a 100 million aid package, 100 million pound aid package to Ethiopia. So famine funds in the 1840s, when translated into their contemporary value, rival the kinds of humanitarian projects we see today. But it was really the first time that this much money was garnered from around the world for a particular local crisis. I also think it's worth noting that even small donations were extremely consequential. So some people gave tremendous amounts, but quite a lot of donors gave a few cents or $1. So really small amounts, but which nevertheless were really consequential parts of their own household budgets. So quite a lot of these donors were themselves not wealthy. This isn't a case of rich people having too much money and sending it away. So I found thousands and thousands of donors who gave these really tiny amounts, but tiny amounts that meant that they were unable to buy perhaps their own food, right? So small amounts for us, large parts of their budgets. This fits with more recent philanthropic trends that we see, which show us that the very rich and the very poor donate in much higher proportions than other socioeconomic groups. And so I think in addition to just the sheer number of donors, it's really interesting and compelling that so many of these donors had relatively little and nevertheless decided to send their money to Ireland. So I've talked about this being sort of a unique or unprecedented event, and that's because in the 19th century, it was really uncommon to send money overseas. And if money was being sent overseas, it tended to be sent to like co-religionists or family members who happened to have emigrated. It was almost unheard of to send money to meet the needs of strangers. The kind of charity that people practiced in this time was much more close by, so that people would send money to those who they could see and whose gratitude they could immediately receive. So think about a local elite sending money to the local poorhouse, right? The local elite could be celebrated because people knew that he or she had given money. And it was also a sort of a social marker of saying, I'm better off than you are because I can afford to publicly give you these funds. So the scale of interest in Irish humanitarian relief was unprecedented. And the sort of kind of giving was also unprecedented. And a big motivation for me to write this book was to explain why an Irish crisis in particular triggered this apparently spontaneous interest in international aid.
So that's quite obviously kind of the next question I have to ask. What was happening? Nothing comes out of nowhere, right? So what was happening, for example, in terms of philanthropic concepts, I guess, such that this was the right cause at the right time for this unprecedented giving to happen?
So I think there are sort of two parts to that. I have two parts to that answer. The first is that this was a period where people were learning to care about sufferers at a distance. So before you can think about sending money to people you've never met, you have to sort of be able to think about them as people and to be able to think that your actions, sending money, might have consequences for them. And so the background to this whole story is in some ways the very successful campaign by, amongst other people, Quakers, to abolish slavery in the slave trade. So abolitionists through the 19th or the 18th and 19th century had been working incredibly hard to cast slavery as the sort of the most uniquely inhumane force in the world. And to do so, they sort of were encouraging people around the world to care about the plight of enslaved people or people who could be enslaved. So I think that is part of the background here. People had been encouraged for a long time to think about others. There's also, I think, a pretty compelling argument that just the way that capital worked and had been working throughout the early 19th century was encouraging people to think about the possibility that their money that they had in one place could be used somewhere else. So Thomas Haskell actually argued in the 1980s that it was precisely the rise of capitalism and the attendant ability to move money at a distance that made it possible for people to imagine humanitarianism at a distance. So once people could say, okay, the funds that I put into a bank here can be spent across the world. And vice versa. They could also say, okay, the funds that I'm giving to an organization locally can be used across the world. So I think part of it is just that there were some uh, technical and affective shifts before the famine that sort of primed people to think about distant giving. But it's also the case, I think, that Ireland was offered a particular framework for crisis that was really compelling to a wide range of people. So the sort of shorthand version of that is that many, many things were going wrong in Ireland. And so if you wanted an example of failed processes, you could usually find that process failing in Ireland in the 1840s. So the potato famine itself was caused by a fungus called the late blight. And it decimated crops in Ireland, but also across Europe. The reason that we talk about the Irish famine and not the European famine is that in Ireland, most rural people subsisted only on or mostly on potatoes, because potatoes were the crop that could be grown on really small, really barren parcels of land. So, if you wanted an example of sort of failures of landholding systems, you could look to Ireland and say landlords who owned most of the land that people who were starving to death lived on should have given their tenants better land or more opportunities, or should not have pushed them to places where they could only eat potatoes. If you want an example of imperialism gone awry, Ireland also provides that example. There were many ways in which Ireland was operating sort of like a colony of Britain, even though it was so close to it. So the Royal Irish Constabulary, for example, the police force in Ireland in the 1840s, was the model for colonial police forces in Africa and in the Caribbean. So there were many ways in which Ireland looks quite a lot like a colony structurally. But also, Ireland was able, Irish people, a subset of Irish people, were able to elect representation in Parliament. So if you wanted sort of an example of what the complicated parliamentary system gone wrong looks like, you could look to Ireland. This was also a period in which there was a sort of a push amongst some Irish politicians for an independent Ireland. And so if you wanted examples of why nationalism was actually the solution to Irish problems rather than an affiliation with Britain, you could look to Ireland. So it ended up being this kind of crucible of failures of governance and obligation that many of the donor groups that I talk about could sort of find analogs in.
I'm wondering if I can ask you a bit more about some of those groups. You talked a bit just now about kind of politicians and how they're using the famine in arguments around nationalism and to some extent empire. What about, for example, the press, or I guess what we would call today non-governmental organizations? What were the sorts of ways that they were discussing and framing the famine in these kind of, as you said, the bigger points that could be made through it?
So I think the big framings that I saw were these sort of first like national politics. Should Ireland have self-government? And this goes back to in the early 19th century. In the 18th century, Ireland actually had a self-governing parliament of a sort. And then in 1801, that parliament was dissolved and Irish MPs were sort of folded into the British government, or British parliament in Westminster. And so quite a few commentators on the island of Ireland said the famine is either an example of why we need our own parliament, because if we had our own parliament, we could more directly attend to Irish needs. And other people said, well, the problem here is that Irish politicians have been focusing too much on independence and not enough to the needs of everyday people. So there was a series of debates about what the Irish nation should look like, whether it should be linked to Britain, whether it should be independent, and then what that meant about who should provide relief. And so one of the sort of most famous Irish politicians of this period, Daniel O'Connell, actually said, we cannot accept relief from Britain because doing so ties us to Britain in a way that is dangerous to the cause of nationalism. So and this was in 1845, very early in the famine, he linked the question of who should be allowed to relieve Ireland to Irish national politics. And then sort of as news of the famine moved beyond Ireland, as it was reported in Britain and then in the United States, and then even in Indian territory, what the famine was about sort of shifted and became malleable. So in some of these places, it was really about empire. In some of these places, it was about government reform and obligation. In others, it was about the failures of landlords to live up to their obligations. And so one of the things that I wasn't expecting, but was really fascinating to me, was to watch this story sort of be reframed as it moved from site to site around the North Atlantic world.
I also found that particularly interesting, and so kind of want to go on that journey again, I suppose, asking you to take us round. So, can we move from Ireland itself to England? And what sorts of debates were happening here? You talk a lot about kind of concepts of Britishness and government reform that was already debates that were going on. How did the famine play into these existing debates about that and about kind of ideas, not just Britishness in Britain, but the context of the whole British Empire?
Yeah. So one of the things that struck me when I began this book is that many of the sort of extant academic narratives about British responses to the famine have focused, unsurprisingly, on people in positions of power, right? So scholars are interested in how the people who might have stepped in to alleviate Irish distress acted the way they did. And a lot of those people had some pretty horrifying ideas about the Irish. So this has been documented by Michael Denis in a book called The Eternal Paddy, where he basically argues that the prevailing idea amongst British elites was that Irish people were fundamentally and also racially distinct from English people, and that their Celticness was actually the cause of all of Ireland's problems. They called the potato a lazy crop, so they sort of invested the potato itself with these racialized ideas of backwardness, and all as a way of saying that the Irish themselves were to blame for the famine. And that is certainly an important part of understanding British responses to the famine. But as I started to read the British press sort of outside of these elites talking to one another, I found some other additionally compelling uses of the famine and the necessity of famine relief. So the first one is primarily a narrative in British industrial cities, so Manchester and Liverpool, and to a certain extent, Glasgow. And these are cities in the later 1840s and 1850s and 1860s where we see just incredible anti-Irish sentiment, like incredible bias against Irish people. But in the early years of the famine, there's this moment where people in these cities, and this is a time when these cities were booming, their populations were booming, and the people who lived there were mostly laborers, where these laborers, who would later go on to be virulently opposed to Irish people coming to Britain, had a moment of solidarity with the Irish. And they had a moment of solidarity with the Irish because of this economic structure called the Corn Laws. So the Corn Laws were a policy that was designed to regulate grain prices within the United Kingdom, including Ireland, and protect British domestic producers. So what they did was basically say, if European grain is cheaper than British grain, we level a tariff on European grain until it reaches the same cost as British grain. So this was a way of making sure that British producers of grain and corn, like edible plants, weren't going to be undercut by European markets. And this is great if you are a landlord or you're a producer of grain products, but it's really bad if you're a laborer trying to buy cheap bread, and it's really bad if you're an Irish tenant farmer who does not have money to buy food. So the Corn Laws were enacted before the famine, and there was a campaign sort of throughout the 1830s and 1840s to repeal them, mostly by laborers in these industrial cities who were saying, it's unreasonable for the elites to have these laws that protect their product when we are unable to feed our families. And so when it becomes clear that Irish people are beginning to starve, the people who were opposed to the Corn Laws sort of enfold Irish people into their community of Britons. They say, we, like the Irish, are politically marginalized. We, like the Irish, are suffering because of these Corn Laws. And so if you want to relieve Ireland, what you need to do is repeal the Corn Laws. And it's sort of this moment that is in opposition to a lot of ideas that we have about laboring British responses to the famine, because the traditional story is that they're just really, really opposed to helping the Irish at all. So we have this like short-lived moment of solidarity where commentators in British industrial cities rhetorically cast the Irish as sort of part of this broader community of Britons. And in doing so, they positioned humanitarianism towards the Irish as synonymous with British laboring interests. Once the Corn Laws are repealed, that sort of solidarity falls apart pretty quickly. But for me, it was a really clear example of how the question of relief, even at a policy level, was immediately tied to sort of local or more personal political needs and interests. In contrast, in London, commentators are really just using the famine as almost this test case for different ideas of what the British Empire should look like. So the Times of London, which was probably the newspaper that most represented sort of elite political interest in this period, late in the famine is talking about like who should be funding ongoing famine relief. And the anonymous author of an article asks, who is to pay? Is it the empire, the island, the union, the parish, the township, or the landowner? And I thought this was a really interesting framing because it pointed to sort of all of the ways that you might think about who was obligated to aid the suffering. The Times of London ultimately comes down on it not being an imperial obligation. They believe, the authors of the paper, or the editors of the paper and the people who wrote articles, believed that the Irish sort of needed to haul themselves up by their bootstraps and become more productive members of the imperial community. So work harder to be productive before they should receive aid. So this is an understanding of empire that's very much about people owe things to the empire. There was another school of thought that was sort of drawing on a liberal reformist tradition that argued that the empire was designed to uplift subject populations. And so in their understanding of the empire, Ireland should be helped precisely because the Irish were so quote unquote backwards. And so these two ideas, neither one of them particularly won out in amongst the London commentariat. But again, it showed me that the famine sort of provided this crucible or this space to think about pressing political ideas at the moment. And in London, the question was really like, what does the empire look like? Who is it supposed to serve? Who is it meant to benefit?
So let's continue then this idea of going to places, figuring out what their politics are already discussing, and then how the famine is sort of brought in and leveraged amongst those debates. Can we go across the ocean and discuss this in New York City?
Yes. So New York City is where sort of the meaning of the famine really fractures, or I could sort of imagine like a beam of light going into a prism and just shooting out all of these different colors and interpretations. So New York City was in this period really a political hub for the United States. It was also one of the first places that news from Ireland and England arrived in North America. And so just in terms of the news ecosystem, ships would carry newspapers from Ireland and England across the Atlantic, and then editors in New York would sometimes take those clippings and reprint them wholesale. So would just like copy what other writers had written, or would sometimes condense them and then send them by telegraph out to other newspapers farther inland. And so New York sort of was a space where news was made and remade almost constantly. And it was also really a seat that it was the center of power for the Democratic Party in this period, and particularly for conflicts within the Democratic Party about would the Democratic Party be focusing more on sort of bankers and moneyed elites? Would it be focusing more on everyday people? Are those interests actually in conflict? And so those political groups really latched on to the famine in some really interesting ways. So the way that I find to be the most sort of odd or compelling is in debating whether or not the United States should try to annex what is now Texas and also go to war with Mexico. So people who opposed the United States' sort of expansionist mission into the American West would turn to Ireland as an example of what happens when a metropole, like London, tries to control space that is really difficult to control, full of people who do not want to be controlled. Another part of the arguments that these same people leveraged was that the United States could better spend the money that it had aiding the Irish than it could prosecuting this ongoing and bloody war. And so one of the examples they turn to are these two ships that Congress sort of says, we'll give you these American ships, you can fill them with grain and you can take them to Ireland. We won't send money directly to Ireland, but you can have these two decommissioned ships. One of those ships actually had been a British Army or British Navy ship that was seized by the US Navy. And so these people who are saying, like, we really need to not be engaged in this ongoing war with Mexico, say, number one, prosecuting that war is going to create for us a situation like Britain has with Ireland. It's going to give us this group of people who really don't want to be part of our polity and who are going to cause us ongoing trouble. And also, wouldn't it just be better if we took those funds and sent them towards aiding the Irish, who will then maybe immigrate here and vote for us? So there was this sort of weird, sort of circular argument that said we should help the Irish in Ireland. They also might come to the United States. It would be good to have people vote for us in the United States. But then also saying to Irish immigrant communities, hey, look at us. We're trying to help your people. Doesn't that mean that you want to vote for us in upcoming elections? So it, in some ways, feels like a really craven use of famine relief, right? Saying, like, this policy, we are supporting this policy because it will garner us voters. But there was a sense, I think, in amongst the political elites of New York that the famine was really malleable, and it could be malleable both in terms of U.S. policy in Mexico, but also could be malleable in terms of narratives to prospective voters.
So, speaking of using the famine for various purposes, and especially kind of, as you said, the malleability of the message and the framing, can we go south? Why
Yes.
did Southern enslavers want to contribute to famine relief, and specifically Irish famine relief?
So this is one of a couple of case studies that I was really not expecting and found to just be really compelling, but also really troubling. So the Charleston Hibernian Society was this fraternal organization that was sort of unique at the time. Most of the communities who I looked at were not affiliated with Ireland at all. The Charleston Hibernian Society was different, right? It's in the name. It's a society of people who have some kind of Hibernian roots. But it was in the 1840s mostly Protestant and middle class, and had sort of become a place where the movers and shakers of Charleston could get together. So the Hibernian Society organized raising of funds throughout the U.S. South, and a disproportionate number of their donors were enslavers. I think that the enslavers participated in famine relief for a couple of reasons, but the one that I just continue to find the most flummoxing, I guess, to write and think about is that they said, we are actually like the Irish. Just as the Irish are oppressed by the British, just as British economic interests consistently override the economic interest of Ireland, so too are the economic interests of enslavers consistently overridden by the economic interests of the US federal government. And this is a wild claim on the face of it, because obviously enslavers weren't poor, weren't starving to death. But they saw sort of the example of Ireland as a sort of quintessential suffering group and said, we can leverage that suffering and make an argument about how we are similarly oppressed. At the same time, I think individual enslavers were really invested in showing that they were humane at a time when, as I said previously, abolitionists had done a really good job of casting slavery as the ultimate humanitarian crisis of the time. Um, and actually, the people who were receiving money from enslavers were really concerned about this use. So there was the Society of Friends in Dublin received a bunch of donations from the Charleston Hibernian Society. And one of their members, who was named Richard Allen, wrote this long letter to his fellow friends, saying basically, we cannot accept we cannot accept these funds. If we do so, it justifies enslavers' pretensions to genuine kindness and compassion. So he was really seeing these donations as a way for enslavers to kind of launder their reputation, to make themselves look good in the eyes of the world. And he said, we absolutely cannot take their money. He was ultimately outvoted. The members of the Society of Friends said, we hear you, but this is a lot of money and people are starving to death. But it was really interesting to me that people, even at the time, were looking at particularly donations from enslavers and saying, this is doing political work beyond helping the Irish. Folded into these two uses, so kind of the reputational laundering and then also claiming to be like the Irish, was this argument that enslavers made throughout the period that actually enslaved people were better off than Irish people. So as soon as the famine began to be widely reported in the Southern press, there were these comparisons between people starving to death in Ireland and enslaved people in the United States. And sort of in the same way that Richard Allen said, oh, we need to be careful about the use of these donations. Actually, Frederick Douglass wrote quite a lot about how abolitionists needed to be really, really careful about these comparisons between Irish people and enslaved people. Douglass was actually touring Ireland during the famine, and at every opportunity, he talked about how, yes, Irish suffering is real. Yes, people starving to death is a real problem, but the Irish were free. And so he kept repeating that, I think, sort of as a way to argue against what he was seeing from the Southern press that said that actually it's better to be enslaved than to be Irish. So it was this whole constellation of claims that were basically giving to Ireland or using Irish relief as a way to point out or as a way to make the argument that they thought slavery was humane, that enslavers were humane, and that in fact enslavers were the most oppressed people in the U.S. South. And I think Ireland became the cause that allowed them to do that because there was widespread understanding that Irish suffering was real, and also because there was widespread understanding in the United States that one of the causes of Ireland's misfortune was actually its political relationship to Britain. And so enslavers were able to point to those fairly common understandings of the crisis and say, just as we are, or just as Ireland is oppressed by Britain, we are oppressed by the United States, which continues just to be a claim that I guess flummoxes me.
Yeah, no, I think I'll join you in that one. Staying in the politics of the American South, but moving away from that flummoxing position or group, can you help us understand the decision of Black churches in the American South to send money to Irish famine relief? What are the goals of this? And what do you think we can understand from these actions?
Yeah. So I think this is my favorite example or case study in the book. And that's because it is in many ways really surprising, but sort of opens up an opportunity to talk about philanthropy as political action in ways that I think are relatively new. So the First African Baptist Church was a congregation in Richmond, Virginia. Its members were both free and enslaved. And that is because the church had actually begun as one for both Black and white parishioners. But in 1841, the white church members decided that they didn't want to worship with their Black neighbors and spun off an entirely new church, leaving the Black congregants, again, both free and enslaved, to form their own congregation. The First African Baptist Church was really a center of Black life in Richmond. It was a place that when people who were enslaved on plantations in the country. When their enslavers came to Richmond, people would come to the church and worship. And all of that is documented in the church's minute books, which say, this person came from this place, joined our church for some amount of time, and then went away again. The church minute books also record instances of fundraising within the church. And up until 1847, that fundraising was exclusively for other church members. So for poor sufferers or for widows or people in need, but members of the church community. And then in 1847, for the first time ever, they decided to raise funds for a group outside of the church, and that was for the suffering of Ireland. So for me, these records are really compelling because I can say definitively that up until this point, the First African Baptist Church had not engaged in any kind of external philanthropy, let alone overseas philanthropy. The downside of these records is that they don't include any documentation of discussions within the church about why to give. And this is not a period where there are a ton of records kept by congregants about their motivations. This is also a period where there are no Black newspapers in Richmond, right? So the archives that we have access to are white newspapers, which there's a ton of evidence that Black people in Richmond and throughout the South were reading. And also Black newspapers published in the North. And again, there is considerable evidence that those newspapers were circulating in the U.S. South. So the argument that I make in this chapter is that the members of the First African Baptist Church knew that the white press had established the Irish as examples of sort of ultimate suffering. And they also knew that the white press was really keen on using the example of the Irish to argue that U.S. slavery was actually not so bad. So if that was the only way that congregants of the First African Baptist Church were experiencing Ireland, I think their donation to Ireland makes very little sense. But we also know that the white press described donations to Ireland by white Richmonders as sort of markers of incredible humanity and incredible morality. So I think that the reason that they gave was to sort of adopt a vernacular of white vernacular of white philanthropy, which said giving to the Irish is a marker of sort of ultimate humanity, and said, we too can participate in this thing that you have said is the ultimate marker of humanity and morality. So I think it was a way to show white Richmonders that they were just as worthy as celebrated white donors. And the fact that they raised funds for Ireland but nowhere else tells me that this donation was doing some particularly important political and rhetorical work. And I think that political and rhetorical work is linked to the ways in which the white press was describing Ireland. So I don't think that this was an act of solidarity. I don't think it was a donation that was meant to show that enslaved people and Irish were suffering in the same way, but rather a way to say, you've said that these people are the ultimate sufferers, and giving to them means that you are superior to them. So we are going to adopt that framework too. There's another case study that I begin the book with, but don't spend a lot of time on just because the archive is so thin, actually, of a group of enslaved people in Alabama who are sort of called together by the man who enslaved them and asked if they would give up one meal a day to aid the starving Irish. And they say no. So they reject his request to give up one meal a day, but instead go away and come back with $50. And I think that they were doing a really similar thing, right? Adopting white vernaculars of charity in order to make a claim about their own humanity at a time when basically all other white commentary was saying that they were less than human.
So picking up then on that exact point, the idea of making political statements using the vernacular politics, can we go back right to the example that kind of started you down this path in the first place, the contributions from Native Americans to Irish famine relief?
Yeah. So this is probably the one that most people know the most about. The Choctaw donation is the most famous, but around the same time, also the Cherokee Nation raised funds for Ireland. So the famine, as I said at the beginning, took place a decade after Cherokees and Choctaws and other tribes from the North American Southeast had been violently expropriated by the U.S. government, largely because white settlers wanted their land. This is the thing, or the series of events often known as the Trail of Tears. And so 1845, 1846, 1847 are about a decade after this violent expropriation. While no one at the time was using the language of anti-colonialism, sort of in the way that we use it today, Cherokees and Choctaw leaders were very critical of the United States' behavior and often linked those critiques to the behavior of the British government. So sort of in the same way, actually, that enslavers said, we can all agree that Britain has treated Ireland terribly. Cherokee and Choctaw leaders did the same thing, but instead of saying that enslavers were like the Irish, Cherokees and Choctaws compared themselves to the Irish. Like the congregants of the First African Baptist Church, Cherokees and Choctaws singled Ireland and Irish famine victims out especially. And we know this because actually many Cherokees had personal connections to Scotland. In fact, the principal chief of the Cherokee Nation, John Ross, was himself of both Scottish and Cherokee descent. And he, at some point, gave a speech that said, to the Choctaws, that said, look, it's great that you care about the Irish, but are we not going to send money to Scotland also? It seems like there was still an overwhelming number of donations sent to Ireland even after he sort of had this call to also send money to Scotland. So Cherokee and Choctaw people were selecting Ireland in particular, and I think they were selecting Ireland in particular because narratives of failed British imperialism were really powerful in the United States at this time period. So I think that for the Cherokees and Choctaws, famine relief did two things. First, sort of like the donation from the First African Baptist Church, it undermined white Americans' claims that indigenous people were uncivilized at a time when U.S. federal policy relied on the notion of native incivility, right? So all of U.S. policy towards indigenous people in this period was built on the idea that they were unable to exist in white society. And so by using, again, this vernacular of charity that was really familiar to white Americans and which white Americans used to sort of pat themselves on the back and celebrate their civility, indigenous people were saying, this kind of civility is not, civility is in air quotes here, is not only available to you, but in fact comes from our own giving traditions that are completely separate from sort of white giving practices. But also, I think famine philanthropy allowed indigenous commentators to juxtapose this widely condemned British imperialism with the United States policies of indigenous marginalization and appropriation at a time when they didn't have a lot of other tools available for critique at their disposal. This violent uprisings against the U.S. government were not possible at this time, and in part just because of the devastation of the Trail of Tears and the Indian removal policies. So the famine and giving to Ireland presented an opportunity to sort of illustrate solidarity that leveraged these, again, widespread ideas about British failures in Ireland.
Very interesting to kind of start off with that and then having done our tour gone, oh, wait, now there's a whole bunch of extra nuance and politics, really, that we can understand here rather than just go, that's strange. So thank you for taking us on this tour of geography. Can we now do a shorter tour? I promise. I've already asked you lots of questions. But a tour, I suppose, through time from this moment to today. What kinds of legacies or links do you think we can see?
So I think that for people who work on the history of philanthropy, the 20th century, the early 20th century is really this inflection point where you start to see the rise of what's called institution philanthropy. We see the origins of the NGOs that are really common and prevalent today. And I think there's a lot of work that has demonstrated that these institutions, like, the Carnegie nonprofit ecosystem or the Ford Foundation, do political work just as they are doing philanthropic work. A lot of them are associated with soft power, right? So nonprofits will go out into the world and sort of, in exchange for money, ask people to change their behaviors. And so I think we're pretty familiar with that story of NGOs and philanthropic groups exercising power, just as they are also doing real good in the world. So I think one of the things that I'm really excited about my book doing is giving the backstory to the rise of institution philanthropy. And sort of the way you asked a question earlier about sort of things don't just spring up from nothing. I think we can't really understand how institution philanthropy becomes and has always been political without understanding these earlier moments when people, a bunch of non-elite people, were imagining philanthropy as a political tool. So I think it's a useful sort of bridge from the mid 19th to the early 20th century. But I'm also just always kind of astonished how even today, in sort of popular commentary about philanthropy, there is this sense that philanthropy has to be, in order to be pure, it has to be altruistic, right? There has to be no benefit to the givers or no benefit to the funding organization. They should only be ever doing good. And I think that's not true, right? Basically every example that we see of philanthropy sees a benefit to the funding organization in some way, even if it's reputational. But what I'm hoping that my book does is sort of point out that philanthropy and humanitarianism and relief have always been intertwined with politics, and that's not a bad thing. That doesn't undermine the good that they do, right? Irish people were fed with the donations raised from around the world. That effort shouldn't be undermined by the fact that many people sent money to Ireland because they saw political value in doing so. I'm also hopeful that people who do philanthropic work today will sort of think about the resonances between their own projects and this one, and the philanthropic projects that I've talked about, and really think about how fundraising is almost always going to be interpreted by people who are going to link the cause, the crisis, to some experience of their own. So I'm hopeful that this will be of use to people who are sort of working in contemporary philanthropy and also scholars of philanthropy. One of the sort of resonances that it was really interesting to see, I finished this book sort of in the COVID time, and actually Irish people raised a bunch of money to send to the Navajo Nation, and sort of a resonance or an echo of the donation from the Choctaw Nation to Ireland, when the Navajo Nation was suffering from sort of much higher numbers of deaths due to COVID than the rest of the United States. And so I'm interested in the way in which the idea of that donation has really persisted and echoed. And I hope that some of these other donations will become more visible and also persist and echo in some interesting ways.
What an enticing way to end our discussion on the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I do have one final question, though.
Mm-hmm.
The book is done, it's out, it's available.
Yes.
Are there things you're thinking of working on next, whether or not they're on this topic, whether or not they're a book?
Yes. So I have two things that are kind of preoccupying me at the moment. One is, in the course of writing this book, I put together a database of famine donors. And while some of the people who gave didn't record their names, right? So famously, the members of the First African Baptist Church, their names were not included in the documentation of their donation. Neither were the names of Cherokees and Choctaws. But for quite a lot of white donors, we have the names of individual people and how much they gave. And I am really interested in collaborating with other historians or scholars of philanthropy in the 19th century to actually try to build a database or an archive of people who were giving to other causes in this period, to try to sort of bring our various archives together to try to get a better sense of what the vast philanthropic landscape was in the middle decades of the 19th century. So I suppose that's a little bit of a plea to anyone working on this. If you also have an archive and would like to talk about collaboration or putting our archives together, I would love to do that. But the next book is going to stay in the theme of Irish and Irish American history, but actually turn to New York City, where in the 19th century, right, thousands and thousands of Irish people leave Ireland. 2 million people leave Ireland. Thousands and thousands come to New York City. A number of them are poor, a number of them are sick, a number of them are unable to support themselves. And when they encounter agents of New York City, so police officers or aldermen or doctors, they're often sent to Bellevue, which is the almshouse in New York at the time. It was the only public health institution. And so I'm interested in how immigrants navigated this public health system. And I'm particularly interested because when Irish immigrants were sent to Bellevue, their entry paperwork recorded the disease that they entered with as being immigrants. So there's a disease column, and for all of these Irish people, somebody wrote in the disease column, recent immigrant. And I'm just really interested in that and sort of the pathologization of immigrant status. So I'm at the very beginning of that project, but I'm going to do something about that because I think that's a story that needs to be told.
Yes, please. That one bit of information alone. Goodness, of course you have to go investigate that. We will wait eagerly, I think, for that to progress. But of course, in the meantime, listeners can read the book we've mainly been talking about, titled Aiding Ireland, the Great Famine and the Rise of Transnational Philanthropy, published by NYU Press. Anelise, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.